This is the public domain book, The Gay Adventure, a Romance, by Richard Byrd. Chapter VII. Mr. Hedderwick's First Adventure. "Alicia, my dear," said Robert Hedderwick to his wife as he was smoking after dinner, "shall we talk about our annual holiday?" His wife, a determined lady of 45, 6 years younger than he, put down her knitting. "By all means, Robert, if you wish. But I do not know what there is to discuss. It is not yet July, and we never go away till August, so there is plenty of time." "But why should we not go away in July this year?" he suggested, somewhat diffidently. "Why should we?" "Well, it would be a change. A most undesirable and unnecessary change," said his wife decisively, picking up her knitting again. "August is the hottest month, and August in London would be unbearable. Besides, change for the mere sake of change is childish. You might as well suggest our going somewhere else than Cromer." "Well, said Mr. Hedderwick nervously, "why shouldn't we? Cromer is a charming place." "Charming, but we have been there 12 years running." "Don't you think—" "Cromer suits my health, and yours," Alicia added after a moment's thought. "And Mother would be disappointed if we didn't go. You don't seem to have thought of that." Her husband opened his mouth to say, "I have, my dear," but changed the words to, yes, of course." Then he got up, walked to the window in rather an aimless fashion, and stared out. Presently he began to whistle. "Please do not whistle, Robert," said Alicia reprovingly. "You know I cannot endure it." "I beg your pardon," said Robert submissively. "I forgot." "You want something to do," observed his wife, as one who gives an order. "You've done nothing but smoke since dinner. Why don't you go and dig in the garden?" I don't feel like gardening, or read. Where is your book that—" I don't feel like reading." "The truth is, you don't know what you do want," said Alicia firmly. "You men are just like children when you haven't got a definite task. Until you retired from the business you were always perfectly happy. Now that your days are free you don't know what to do with yourself. Here, come and hold my wool for me." She laid her knitting down on the table and picked up a skein of white wool that lay near. Her husband, with a resigned expression, mutely held up his hands. The wool was placed over them, and then, after strict injunctions not to stir, or get tangled, or drop an end, or breathe too audibly, Mrs. Hedderwick began to wind it into a ball. As the uncongenial task went on, Robert reflected disconsolately that his bid for freedom had not met with much success. He had had hopes that this year, at least, Alicia would have consented to go to some other place for their holiday. He was tired of Cromer and wanted a change. Also, he was not enthusiastic for another holiday spent under the wing of Alicia's mother, Mrs. Ainsley. She was too like her. He checked the heretical thought and substituted too determined to make him anxious to renew her acquaintance more often than he was obliged. Obliged. The word buzzed unpleasantly in the brain. His prophetic instinct told him that he would be obliged to yield to Alicia's wishes. If he ventured to suggest once more that Eastbourne or Brighton might be preferable to Cromer, he knew too well what would happen. Alicia would say firmly, "No, Robert, you know we settled on Cromer, and it would be silly to change our minds now." Supposing he dared greatly and put his foot down, supposing he said, "I will not go there, I will go to Brighton," what would happen? He knew perfectly well that he would never have the courage to be so rebellious as all that, but he kept playing with the notion as one plays with temptation in daily life. If only he dared, he might say, "I will not, Alicia," and then bolt from the house. It would be rather fun, an adventure, to run away. All by himself. By himself. What a holiday that would be! He laughed aloud at the thought. "I see nothing amusing in the wool being tangled," said Alicia's voice reprovingly, and he jumped in alarm. "I was not laughing at that, my dear," he said appeasingly. "I was thinking of something else." Alicia sniffed, but maintained a fortunate silence. When she finished, she said, "I am going out to take the sewing meeting for an hour or so. Will you be in?" "Yes, my dear," said Robert cheerfully, and a few minutes later he heard the front door close. Left to himself, he walked to the window and resumed his idle staring. Remembering that now he was a free agent, he began to whistle again, a trifle mournfully, for he was meditating on life. This, for the average man, as a rule, begets melancholy, particularly if it is his own life he reflects on. Robert Hedderwick had been chief cashier in a big store for more than 15 years. He had earned £250 a year, with an occasional bonus, for some time, and on the whole he had enjoyed his work. At least it had always been interesting, and had given him that most necessary of all things, regular and definite occupation. and though at times he used to wish he was a partner or had more prospects, still he had been contented. Then at the age of 50, an uncle had died and left him a handsome competence. Alicia at once had made him forswear the office and set up as a gentleman of leisure. Not that he had been unwilling to obey. At first he had welcomed the relief from thraldom. It was a luxury to be able to lie in bed a little longer, if he wished, without feeling, I must get up now, or I shall miss the 8:50. It was a luxury to sit at ease in his strip of garden on a fine morning and read the newspaper. It was not unpleasant to think that his former colleagues were saying, lucky chap, Hedderwick, what time they were under the eyes of their master. But these and similar luxuries palled after a time, and he began to grow, not exactly discontented, but restless and vaguely unhappy. He had no hobbies save reading, and none but the ardent student wishes to read throughout the day. He felt himself a little old to begin photography, stamp collecting or wood carving. Still, recognizing the need of some occupation, he tried to do a little gardening. The strip of land at the back of the house was small, being some 30 yards long by 20 broad. 2/3 of this was grass, which he mowed conscientiously once a week. The rest was given up to flowers. As Robert knew nothing of flowers, he employed a man to do what was necessary in the way of digging and planting. When the serious business of horticulture was finished, he would employ himself in cutting off dying blossoms, uprooting weeds and watering. But the sum total of his labour in the little plot did not amount to more than 4 or 5 hours a week. His wife was an active, too active for the vicar's wife, supporter of St. Fried's Church, and when her husband became one of the leisured classes, she did her utmost to spur him to a like interest. He obeyed passively, became a sidesman, and in due course vicar's warden. He was not, to use the vicar's words, a keen churchman, being on the whole an optimistic pragmatist rather than a devotee of dogma. But he was a good man, cheerful, kindly, with some harmless vanities. He liked, for example, to take the alms bag round and lead the procession of collectors. He would complain of the trouble entailed by the organisation of the annual treat or the parish tea, but secretly he appreciated the occupation and the importance thereof. These things helped to fill a portion of a vacant existence, but they were not enough. He felt that he was rusting. This evening, melancholy marked him for her own. It had been a day more vacant of incident than usual, and he was almost bad-tempered. The thought of the recent defeat by Alicia rankled, and he turned over in his mind schemes by which he could outwit her and procure a holiday in Brighton. It's all very well, he grumbled to himself, but I don't see why I should continually knuckle under. I've been too easy-going. It's time things were put on a different footing. I wonder if— He was still wondering when Alicia returned, and the solution of his difficulties was not yet. Alicia, who was in an aggressive good humour, commented on his dullness. Robert replied in a tone that she characterized as snappy. She also made the inevitable suggestion that he had eaten something that disagreed with him. Good Lord, said Robert, goaded at last beyond caution and fear. Who wouldn't be snappy, doing nothing half the day, and the other half doing what he doesn't like? Nothing ever happens here. It's like being a fly buzzing in a tumbler. He can't get out, though he can see all sorts of interesting things through the glass. You ought to be thankful for your many mercies, said his wife coldly. She knew the treatment for the case. Instead of grumbling like a child, you had better go to bed. That is, if you have finished supper. At that moment Mr. Hedderwick had one of the strongest temptations of a blameless life. He yearned for the courage to say, "Oh, damn the supper," but broke into a perspiration at the mere thought. Instead, he had the grace to be astonished at his mood, and weakly answered, "I think I shall, my dear." As he opened the door, his helpmeet suggested he should not forget at his private devotions to ask for a contented spirit. Rebellion returned, and he banged the door. He soon forgot his troubles in sleep. In fact, he did not even hear his wife come to bed. He slept dreamlessly, despite the suggestion that he had committed an error in diet, until 1:15. Then he awoke quite suddenly, with a dim idea that something was happening. He sat up in bed, rubbed his eyes, and listened. No, there seemed to be nothing. Everything was still. Only the regular breathing of his wife, fast asleep, was to be heard. I must have been dreaming, he thought, preparing to lie down again. And then he heard a subdued but distinct noise downstairs. Robert experienced a chill that crept, via the spine and nape, to his brain. The short hairs on the back of his head felt as if they had begun to bristle. A ghostly cowardice flooded his being, penetrating to the uttermost recesses. Good Lord, he thought, it must be a burglar. His first instinct was to lie down and draw the clothes over his head, his second, to jab his wife sharply in the ribs. Company in the imminent peril was his prime necessity. Both these base impulses he controlled. Though elderly, he felt himself still a man, and despite the fact that he had no audience, no public opinion to make heroism easy, he realized that his part must be played alone at all costs. As he came to this resolve, his natural apprehension subsided. He felt calmer, more collected. Sitting up in bed, he listened with strained ears. For a moment there was silence. Then came the quiet, but distinct opening of a door below. His misgivings had a solid foundation, and with a dismal determination, Robert cautiously got out of bed. Why he did not wake his wife he hardly knew. Perhaps it was chivalry, perhaps a subconscious sense that she might spoil the fun. Yes, that was the odd phrase that formed in his mind once the temporary panic was subdued. With a wry smile, remembering his previous complaints of a vacant life and his thirst for adventures, Robert tiptoed cautiously to the dressing table. Here he made a swift and partial toilet. He slicked on a pair of trousers, a coat, and some boots, for in the midst of his apprehensions he had a foolish idea that the burglar might tread on his toes. Then without noise he opened the top right-hand corner drawer, where he kept his collars and handkerchiefs, and took out a small revolver. As he handled the stock, he felt his new manhood glowing like champagne in every artery. Life! He had begun to live. How did it happen that a harmless churchwarden and retired cashier possessed so lethal a weapon? Simply, it was due to a mixture of precaution and romanticism. He had always thought a burglar might come, and deep in his composition lay a vein of adventure. It was fine to have a pistol, a loaded pistol, even though never used. It gave a sense of power and desperation. He sometimes fondled it and dreamed of defending himself against a marauder or a mob. But such demonstrations took place only when his wife was out. Robert took the pistol in an unshaking hand and conveyed himself quietly from the room. He was not in the least frightened now. Indeed, he was beginning to enjoy this new sense of being master of the situation. Quietly he crept downstairs, as close to the wall as possible to prevent creaking. At the foot of the stairs he stood still and listened. There was no sound, but from the keyhole of the drawing-room came a little pencil of light. Behind the door was— What? Robert cocked the pistol, opened the door, and with a little gasp of triumph said, "Hands up." Chapter VIII. A tale ANDITS consequences. There were two people in the room as Mr. Hedderwick opened the door, a man and a lady. The latter, he noted with amazement, was in evening dress, a light cloak being thrown over it. The former wore the ordinary morning dress of a man about town, neat, though a little shiny, and on his head was a top hat. At Robert's command he turned with a violent start. The lady started too, but in a moment recovered her composure and laughed. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I can't say this is an unexpected pleasure, for that would be only a half-truth. And now, what are you going to do?" Robert, considerably taken aback at the character of his prisoners and his own reception, paused a moment before replying. He was breathing a little noisily from pure excitement, but still he was careful to keep the pistol at a threatening angle. "Well," he said slowly, "in the first place I warn you that I shall shoot if you move." "Of course," she agreed brightly, "that would be the most sensible thing to do, but we have no intention of being so foolish. It seems that you hold the whip hand, so shall we sit down and discuss the situation?" "By all means," said Robert, gaping. "You will find that armchair the most comfortable." She seated herself, and her companion was about to follow suit. But he checked himself, picked up a gaily coloured rug from the sofa, and with a smile said, "There is no need for even a jailer to catch cold." He threw it lightly across to Robert, who caught it with a blush. He wished foolishly he had put on a collar. Then the man sat down and looked at the lady as if waiting for instructions. Robert followed his example, taking care to interpose the table between them in case of a surprise. "And now," said the lady again, "what are you going to do? Send for a policeman?" It was the obvious course, but Robert on a sudden felt that it would be impossible. When he had valiantly left his bed, seized his weapon and prepared to capture a burglar or two, he had in mind merely the vision of an ordinary hooligan. The reality upset him. He needed time to adjust his ideas. "I suppose I must," he said apologetically. "I am exceedingly sorry, but really, you know—" "Oh, we quite understand," returned Beatrice, for of course it was she and Lionel, with a frank camaraderie. "It must be a painful position for you as well as for us, But perhaps, before deciding, you would like to hear the reason of our visit." His eyes brightened. He grasped an idea. "Excellent," he said. "I have the satisfaction of having frustrated your design, and honestly I am not in love with the notion of giving you in charge. Besides—" He hesitated as if ashamed, but decided on candor. "My life is a trifle dull, and if you can tell me a really interesting tale, well—" "Sir, you are a sportsman," observed Lionel, and Beatrice added persuasively, "a perfect dear." "Flattery is useless," he replied. "I don't want that. Tell me a good tale, and perhaps—" "I will tell you all," said Beatrice. "If we were captured I had meant to keep silence, but your generous offer compels a change of plan. You shall have a frank, truthful—" "I do not insist on truth," said Robert, stroking his nose, "but it must be interesting." He stopped, aghast at his own depravity. Then he laughed gently. "Morality is hard to achieve at this hour, but come, a good tale." Lionel smiled. He had faith in Beatrice as a storyteller, even if he was a little doubtful of her other qualities. He settled himself on the sofa, prepared not only to hear but criticize. As for Mr. Hedderwick, he was so eager that he laid down the revolver on the table and leaned forward on his elbows. To all appearance he might have been a boy listening to a true yarn of pirates and savages. Beatrice, without effort or hesitation, began to speak. A second Scheherazade, she was fighting for her husband and her own freedom, and everything conspired to lend her aid. She had a thrilling story to tell at first hand. She had the dramatic instinct and an appreciative audience. Not only Mr. Hedderwick but Lionel too listened with rapt attention. The tale lived as told by her, bearing the stamp of truth and humour in every syllable her lips uttered. And Lionel, keeping guard over himself with a loving suspicion, noticed that in no particulars did she depart from the original version. He cursed himself that any shred of doubt could still cling about him. Did any cling? Surely not, and yet, pish! It was not merely disloyal, it was ludicrous. The two stories were identical. Had the first been lies, she must now have betrayed herself. Not that she told her story in such detail as she had to Lionel, there was not time for that. The process of her life and adventures lasted no more than half an hour. All that mattered was there, but the smaller details were absent. A touch here, and the kidnapping was painted in a dozen words, a line there, and she had swept them to Constantinople. A paragraph depicted Lukos with a master hand. A few vivid sentences described the flight. Then came the stage, her meeting with Lionel, 5 pages to the rescue, the taxi deleted altogether, and 3 lines to the dressing room. And lastly, the treachery of Mizzy. She brought her story down to the moment of their capture, not forgetting to tell how they had effected their entrance by means of skeleton keys. "And that is all," she said at last, drawing a breath of relief. "Not quite all," said Mr. Hedderwick with rounded eyes. "Lord, what a tale, what a life!" Compared with this, his eyes wandered discontentedly round the room, and he did not finish the sentence. "But go on, tell me why you hid the papers here." "Partly by chance, partly design. I meant to hide them in a stranger's house, thinking they would be safest there. One evening, as I walked this way, I saw a machine in front of your door. It was a vacuum cleaner. That decided me. It meant that after they had finished, there was no likelihood of your carpets being lifted for some time." "My carpets!" gasped Robert. "What the—" "Oh, do wait," said Beatrice pettishly, and he collapsed, as was only fitting. "I came next day, and the cleaner had gone. During the morning I made discreet inquiries as to your habits and mode of life. In the evening I hired a cab, drove to Kensington to put any possible trackers off the scent, changed into another cab, and drove back here. At 7:30 I called. You were out, and your wife said you would not be back for at least half an hour. I asked if I might wait, as my business was important. She hesitated, but consented, my sables being a guarantee that I had not come with any designs on your plate. However, to my disgust, she insisted on remaining in the room and discussing trivialities. Of course, as long as she remained, I was helpless, and my well-meant hints were disregarded. I was in despair, but presently the cook burst in with a woeful tale of a scorched petticoat, and the situation was saved. Your wife darted out to survey the damage, and the next moment my precious papers were hidden beneath the carpet." Mrs. Hedderwick returned within a very few minutes, full of apologies and, I fear, regrets that she had left the room. I did not prolong my visit. On the plea that I could not wait further, and promising to call again, I managed to escape. If you wish for proof, look under the carpet beneath your chair." Mr. Hedderwick sprang up like an eager schoolboy. He seized the poker, inserted it under the carpet, and with a crackling wrench prized up a yard or two. With trembling fingers he tore it back still farther, and then his face fell. He stood up, a disappointed man. "There is nothing here," he said accusingly. "This is an anticlimax to a capital tale." Lionel did not move, but his face darkened. During the recital he had felt a warm glow of faith pervade his whole being, a glow that was not diminished by the contemplation of Beatrice. By the time she had finished he was a devout adherent, and now the shock of disillusion swung him back once more to the certainty of doubt. He did not speak, but his eyes sought hers in a question he could not put into words. The lady alone seemed unembarrassed. She gave a regretful sigh. "There is no anticlimax," she said. "Rather it is the thickening of the plot. Of course they have been taken by Mizzy." "Has she been there recently? Yesterday?" "Not that I know of," he returned blankly. "It's possible, I suppose, anyhow. It's not a bad idea for a story, but—" "I see you disbelieve still," said Beatrice with a calm disdain. "I had no idea men could be so stupid. I suppose there is nothing for it but to wake Mrs. Hedderwick and ask her." The churchwarden sat down suddenly, as if his knees had given way. "Wake Mrs. Hedderwick," he repeated in a ghastly voice. "Wake my wife! Oh no, it is impossible, quite out of the question." "Not at all. She will know whether anyone has called here, and in justice to my veracity you must ask her." "I insist. Remember our freedom is at stake." Mr. Hedderwick rose, pale but determined. "I beg your pardon," he said politely. "Will you please go at once? I have not the least intention of prosecuting, and I swear that I believe your story. Only will you please go at once?" Lionel chuckled, amused and grateful. "This is hardly fair, sir," he said. "You forget that we want information as to where those papers may have gone. If your wife could tell us whether anyone has called and what his or her appearance—" "No, no," quavered the unhappy Robert. "I cannot consent. You must find out elsewhere." "I cannot have my wife roused. I would not have her here for £1,000. "Indeed, Robert?" said a deep voice from the door. The churchwarden leaped round in a trice. He saw his wife, in the majesty of a dressing-gown, a poker in her right hand, standing in the doorway. His bowels turned to water. "Alicia," he groaned. "Yes," she said with a pleasurable severity. "What does this mean?" Her eye roved austerely, and there was a dead silence. Robert was temporarily annihilated, Beatrice serenely impassive, Lionel amusedly dividing his attention between the two ladies. Presently Mrs. Hedderwick's brow cleared, as if a light had dawned upon her. She began to speak again in a voice that was almost cheerful. "I see," she said. "It is a new idea, Robert. I suppose these are some of your friends, and this is a kind of breakfast party." "I am very sorry that you did not give me earlier warning, or I would have had the dining room ready." "My husband," she said, turning confidentially to Beatrice, "is a man, and naturally does not realize that bacon cannot be fried in a moment and that eggs will not cook themselves. Toast, again, needs a little care, and coffee I always say is worthless unless one looks after it oneself." "Alicia," interposed the miserable Robert, "I do wish you'd be reasonable. For heaven's sake—" "Kindly do not swear, Robert," said his wife, turning ferociously on him. "If I have made a mistake, I am sure it was but natural. If this is not a breakfast party, pray what is it? A man of your age would not indulge in suppers." She gave the word an emphasis that insinuated Cremorne. "So what can I think?" "I hear an unusual noise. I come downstairs and find my husband hobnobbing with a strange gentleman and his friend whom I have met, but—" Lionel rose, but Beatrice was wiser and forestalled him. "Your surprise and indignation are only natural, Mrs. Hedderwick," she said coolly, "but they will be abated when you learn that our untimely visit is in connection with a police affair." Her instinct was right. Curiosity conquered the churchwarden's wife where an appeal to pity or kindred emotions would have failed. She relaxed her frigid attitude and said, "Indeed?" "Yes," pursued Beatrice. "I cannot tell you all at present, but be assured that if it ever comes into court your evidence will be of value." Mrs. Hedderwick smoothed her dressing-gown and determined to appear in the witness-box in mauve. "Will you just tell us this? Did any stranger call here this evening?" "Yes," answered Mrs. Hedderwick, divided between resentment and a thirst for knowledge. "A lady, or at least a female, called and inquired for my husband." "A lady?" ejaculated Mr. Hedderwick. "This promises well." His wife's eye compelled him again to his seat. "I think, Robert, if you evinced less interest in such a subject, it would be more seemly." The female in question asked if she might wait, as she wished to beg a subscription for an anti-suffragist league. I am in sympathy with such an object, and allowed her to remain. In the course of our conversation, she referred to an article on dress in one of the women's papers. I happened to have the journal, and offered to fetch it, she agreed, thinking that the plait of a new blouse might suit my style. "So you left her alone?" broke in Lionel. "For a bare 2 minutes. When I returned she was still there. We discussed the blouse for a while, and presently she said that she must go, but would return later." "Plagiarist," said Beatrice with a smile. "Did you happen to notice how she was dressed?" "I never noticed such things," said Mrs. Hedderwick with dignity. "Dress is not one of my foibles, but after she had gone I picked up a handkerchief which I suppose she had dropped. It was marked." "Wait," said Mr. Hedderwick suddenly. "What is her name?" he asked, turning to Beatrice. "Whose, Robert?" queried his wife. "Oh, bother," he said, irritation lending him courage. "Your maid's. Mizzy Schmidt. And the initials, Alicia?" "M.S." Mr. Hedderwick, his head full of romantic notions of chivalry, forgetting the urgent need of circumspection, rose. He advanced toward Beatrice, raised her hand, and, to the horror of his wife, kissed it solemnly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "There is no anticlimax, now that you know Mizzy is the thief you will want to be off. Good-bye, and good luck." They took him at his word and rose. "Good-bye," said Beatrice in the most ordinary voice. "Thank you so much for your help. And yours too, Mrs. Hedderwick. So sorry we had to break into your house. Good-bye. Now, Mr. Mortimer." "Good-bye," said Lionel. "Thanks most awfully. I felt you were a sportsman as soon as I saw you." They were in the hall by this time, and the magnanimous churchwarden was already opening the door. "Not at all," he said. "I've had a most interesting night. I wish you'd let me know the end of the tale some day." "If it is a happy ending, you shall," said Beatrice. She halted a moment, motioned to Lionel to pass out before her, and then turned. "If you see us again, be careful never to recognize or speak to us. It might mean danger, not only to you, but us." He smiled, but said nothing. Beatrice and Lionel moved away in the light of the early dawn. Mr. Hedderwick closed the door gently and stood deep in thought for a moment. What an adventure! What a splendid woman! What a jolly chap! His thoughts ran. How different their life from mine. Here am I, tied to the same holiday year after year, afraid to call my soul my own. Why should I not have a holiday on my own account? A holiday. By myself for once. Something new, something out of the common. "Robert," said a threatening voice from the drawing-room, and he leaped. "Come in, I have something to say to you." The tone told him what the something would be. His thoughts raced furiously during the next 20 seconds, but he had wit enough to answer, "Yes, Alicia, wait till I have locked the door." Then with a swift but silent movement, he slipped on a greatcoat and hat and stealthily opened the door again. He peered out. Yes, there was hope and an object, for he could see, some 150 yards away, the figures of Beatrice and her escort. With a gasp, Mr. Hedderwick muttered, "I will." He pulled the door to behind him and set out furtively, but with a resolute swiftness, in pursuit. Chapter IX. Enter Tonywild. Tony Wilde, whose address was the Albany, and who enjoyed an unearned income of 2,000 a year, stood on the steps of the Tivoli Music Hall at 10:30, smoking. His face, which was passably attractive, had temporarily lost its usual good humour, and he puffed his cigarette slowly, as if it was more of a task than a pleasure. This, indeed, it was, for he had consumed 17 since getting out of bed at 10 o'clock that morning, and he smoked more from habit than anything else. He was a young man of 26 who pursued happiness, or rather distraction, on the accepted lines, dinners, dances, and the stage formed his daily round, but with the zest of youth or cynicism he constantly searched for new thrills. Experience was his god, and it must be confessed that he had had more than a fair share of sensations. He had been jilted, married. Luckily it proved a bigamous union, as his wife, a Covent Garden chorister, had nothing but her prettiness to recommend her, and Tony had been immensely relieved when her husband reappeared after serving 7 years at Portland, made a descent in a submarine, gone up in a balloon, and driven a car in the Gordon Bennett race. He had flown in an aeroplane once for the sake of a new thrill, but subsequently determined that it would be a pity further to risk 2,000 a year. These were but a few of his distractions. The only experience he had never tried was work. On the whole, he had enjoyed himself. There were times, of course, when he felt that life was a little empty, a little dull, but on such unfortunate occasions he made haste to bring himself up to the scratch by searching for a fresh adventure. His most desperate expedient up to date had been to enlist, but the discipline and routine of the barracks made even ennui seem desirable, and he bought himself out after 24 hours of agony. This evening he was feeling distinctly dull, for the day had been singularly profitless. A solitary breakfast at 11 had been followed by a perfunctory glance over the Daily Mail. Even that stimulating sheet had failed to rouse him, and an afternoon swim at the Bath Club had been terminated by sheer boredom. Dinner at his club had failed to produce any congenial spirits, and in desperation he went to the Tivoli. A few of the turns he enjoyed in a mild and deprecating fashion, but at 10:30 he found himself on the steps, bitterly reflecting on the defects of modern civilization. London, he thought moodily. A city of 6 million people, and not a thing for me to do. Shall I go to bed? It seemed a confession of weakness. Besides, he was not in the least sleepy. So he discarded the unworthy thought and set out on an aimless ramble through the streets. There is always something to look at in London, something to interest, even though it be but the policeman directing the traffic, and Tony soon found his languor past and good humour returning. He liked being among a crowd of people, watching, speculating, enjoying. The Strand was one of his favourite haunts, especially at night when the lamps were lit and the theatres discharging their motley audiences. In Piccadilly Circus at 11 o'clock, Shaftesbury Avenue, Aldwych or the Strand, a man need never feel bored, though he may feel rebellious. Tony walked slowly on, stopping occasionally to observe the people. He looked at his watch presently and found that it was past 11. Early yet, he reflected. What's the use of going home? Shall I try the club or a longer walk? The Embankment, a nocturne of lamps and water, and, yes, that would be a new game. Forward. He turned down to the right and soon found himself by the Thames. Here he proceeded to practice the new game which had just occurred to his active brain. It was simple, if ghoulish, for he merely did his best to imitate a would-be suicide. Turning up his collar and setting his hat a little on the back of his head, he plunged his hands deep into his pockets and assumed an expression of despair. Then he walked slowly along, at times glancing at the river and ostentatiously avoiding the eyes of chance policemen. Presently he stopped, leaned both his elbows on the parapet, and stared gloomily at the Thames. His manoeuvres were crowned with success, for a constable soon approached and told him in a kindly tone to move on. Tony replied in a sepulchral voice, and in a few moments was deep in conversation with his preserver. A fictitious tale of cards and drink exercised the powers of his imagination pleasantly enough for 10 minutes or so, and when they separated it was with a mutual glow of satisfaction. The policeman thought he had saved a brother. Tony had enjoyed himself for a brief space. It did not occur to him that critics might consider his game morbid or in bad taste. Had he been questioned, he would have said, "No doubt you're right, but I was frightfully bored." After this episode, he walked across Waterloo Bridge to enjoy the view, and then returned leisurely to Piccadilly. He was not in the least sleepy, so he determined to extend his walk indefinitely. The great charm, he reflected, of being a bachelor with plenty of money is that one can do exactly what one likes without being questioned. If I return at 6 o'clock in the morning, Pettigrew will admit me without a murmur and ask if I want breakfast. Now, if I had a wife, it is possible that she would take no interest in my midnight ramble. No, she would take too much interest and fear the worst. Well, where shall I go? I feel in excellent trim. Shall I walk to Boulders Green, Whitechapel, the Elephant and Castle? Strange names beckon me. I remember reading of Hackney Marshes as a little boy. Shall I go and see if there are any marshes? Or shall I make for St. John's Wood and see what Lord's looks like in moonlight, where a ghostly batsman plays to the bowling of a ghost, and I look through my tears on a soundless clapping host as the run-stealers flicker to and fro? Yes, let's try Lord's. We need not follow Tony in his walk. It is enough to say that at 4 o'clock he found himself, still wakeful, in Covent Garden, watching the market men at work. After enjoying the sight, he wandered idly up to Oxford Street, and presently the Euston Road. He walked down this till he reached Euston Railway Station, and here he paused to enjoy the freshness of the morning and the quiet of the streets. Gad, he thought, What a shame to lie in bed till 10 o'clock. Why haven't I tried this jape sooner? This is the sort of time when one thinks of the country and hates London. If only there was a train here, I'd go away for a day or two and try it. An idea struck him, and he smiled. Well, here is a station. It might be amusing to go and see if there is a train starting for anywhere. I think I will. I'll make a vow to take a ticket by the first train available and get out wherever the country looks interesting. That at any rate will be something new. He entered Euston Station at 5:15. A sleepy ticket. Clark told him that the first train went at 5:07 and asked whither he meant to travel. Oh, give me a ticket that costs 5 shillings, said Tony. I don't much care. No, dear fellow, I'm not mad, and I've not been drinking. A 5-bob ticket, please. The clerk complied with an ill-used air. Tony received his ticket and went to find the train. As he laid his hand on the door of a first-class compartment, it occurred to him to look at the ticket. It was a third class. Instead of being annoyed, Tony laughed. A night of thrills, he murmured. I haven't travelled third for years. Is there any chance of my having fellow travellers? I should doubt it. There were some 10 minutes before the train was due to start, and Tony occupied the time in looking out of the window. There was not much to engage his attention, save a few porters handling newspapers and other parcels, though presently a man appeared making for the train. Tony glanced at him with a languid curiosity. The newcomer was dressed in a correct morning suit and silk hat. He also carried gloves and a stick. But though he looked like a gentleman and carried himself with an air, Tony's eye detected signs of poverty. The coat was shiny, and the hat, though carefully brushed, had little lustre. What the deuce is he doing here at this time and in such clothes? Thought Tony. Then he burst into a noiseless laugh. The pot and kettle, he reflected, chuckling. I had forgotten that I am still in evening dress. He sank back in the seat to laugh at himself more thoroughly, and the man in the silk hat passed by the window. He made his way into the next compartment, and unfortunately there was no corridor. Tony was debating whether or not it was worth while to get out and join the stranger on the off chance of learning something new when the whistle went. But before the train had begun to move, a face appeared at the opposite window. A man was climbing up the footboard from the line. The next moment the door was opened. The man entered, shut the door behind him, and sat down. He was a man of some 50 years, dressed rather oddly. His bowler hat and overcoat were good, but he wore no collar. Tony looked at him contentedly. After all, this walk was producing experiences. Good morning, he said mildly. Do you usually enter a train on the off-side? I ask merely from vulgar curiosity. The man laughed, panting a little from his exertions. He did not look like a criminal. Indeed, he appeared distinctly meek. He seemed happy too. No, he replied. This is the first time in my life. I am going on a holiday. May I in return ask you if you usually travel in evening dress in the morning? Tony smiled. No, I too am going on a holiday. To Sherling? Asked the man amiably. I don't know. You don't know? No, I was dull. So I took the 5-shilling ticket and the first train. I have no notion where I shall get out. What a splendid idea, cried the other enthusiastically, much to Tony's astonishment. Most of us are so bound by convention that we plot and plan for weeks. Often we even go where we don't want to. Why? The other hesitated. Domestic pressure, he said with a smile. You seem an understanding sort of chap, so I don't mind telling you that. This year, last night, to be candid, I resolved to burst my shackles for a time. Certain events hastened my decision. I am going to Sherling. I left in rather a hurry. You see I have no collar. I suppose I shall have to wait till we get to Sherling now before I can buy one. There's no hosiery department on the train, said Tony. Railway companies are very unimaginative. If there were, I'd buy a decent suit to travel in. Do tell me why you came in that unconventional way. Sorry, said the man, but I can't do that. It's all right, you know. I have a ticket. Of course, agreed Tony politely, and relapsed into musing. Here was a perfect windfall with enormous possibilities. Decidedly he must not lose sight of his new companion. He would get out at Sherling too. Tony studied him from half-shut eyes. He looked a decent little chap, almost jolly, rather like a schoolboy off for a holiday, expecting some excellent pleasure and glorying in the prospect. Also, he was mysterious and secretive, though to outward appearance he was a prosperous businessman in a small way, a head clerk or under-manager perhaps. There was something in his face, too, an innocent zest that appealed to the Blaze young man. Yes, old cock, thought Tony. I must freeze on to you, whether you like it or not. After a silence, the old cock began to crow, and soon there was a brisk conversation in progress. They talked chiefly of trivial things, but held each other's interest nevertheless. Tony's outlook and the newcomers were wide asunder, as also were their experiences. It was the elder man who asked most of the questions, the younger who was responsible for the answers. But they found a bond of union in a Pepysian interest in the novel and unusual, though each approached it from a different standpoint. Tony was a master of external knowledge and sought for something fresh. The other, a babe, welcomed the stalest facts as discoveries from a new world. I wish, he said, and with a sigh, that we were going to travel together for a while. Tony's heart leaped. You are an interesting young man, but no, that is impossible. It would never do. Tony did not reply. He felt sure that the fish was almost hooked, but he did not wish to spoil things by seeming too eager. But he resolved that ere the journey came to an end, he would land his fish and spend a few days in his company. He did not think there would be a slackening of the interest if there were. Why, he could easily go back to town, meanwhile. The train pulled up. Hello, said the elderly man. This train is billed as a non-stop to Sherling. Why on earth? He leaned out of the window and beckoned the guard. What's the matter? He asked. The strike, the guard answered. You see, sir, there are 10 or 15,000 men on strike here just now, and it seems they've got a little out of hand. But what? Asked Tony's companion, effectually filling the window. What has that to do with the trains? Why? You see, sir, continued the guard with an apologetic air, they've got a bit out of hand. I don't know the rights of it. They do say they're underpaid, though the employers say they spend their wages on whippet racing. Anyway, they're out. But the railway man. What? The guard coughed. Some of them's a bit hasty, sir, likewise uncontrollable. It seems that they broke into the publics about midnight, and have been making a night of it, so to speak. They've sent for the soldiers, but they haven't arrived yet, and they've tore up some of the track. The breakdown gang is repairing it, but it will be an hour or so before we can get on. Do you hear that? Rather, said Tony, getting up. Let's go and have a look. I've never seen a raging mob. Better not, sir, advised the guard. The town's not safe. They may listen to me, said Tony with simple grandeur. He turned to his companion. Do you feel like playing with fire? The little man's eyes sparkled and he breathed quickly. He hesitated a moment with natural caution. Then, yes, he said briefly. Dash it. I feel as if I were beginning to live. Tony laughed and opened the door. The guard sighed. Well, gentlemen, he said, don't say I didn't warn you. Anyhow, I'd advise you to leave your money behind and your watches too. The man's a perfect Solon, said Tony, feeling in his trousers pocket. Here, guard, £7.3 and a watch. If I perish, you may keep them, but remember that the watch needs winding night and morning. The guard gazed dumbly at the evening dress. Then he turned to the other man. You anything, sir? Nothing that matters, was the confused reply. Come on, let's make a move. Broke, thought Tony. But he hasn't tried to touch me yet. What a day out. Chapter 10. HOWTO dress, ON nothing a year. The two men left the station and began to walk sharply toward the town, which was close at hand. The first street they entered was deserted, but evidence of the strike lay open to the shamed sky. Lamps, it is true, still stood erect, but their glass was shattered. Missiles and rubbish littered the roadway. Shop windows had not a pane left whole, and here and there makeshift screens of boards replaced or protected the windows. It was a scene of ruin, complete and piteous. The most curious feature was that not a soul was in the street. Everything was still and lonely. In the next street, a similar spectacle met them, ruin and solitude. In a third, the same. In a fourth, the same. It was as if a battle had taken place, or rather as if the town had been sacked and cleared by an invading army, which had passed on like a destroying angel, leaving signs of its progress, and signs alone. This is deuced odd, was Tony's comment. Deuced odd. The ruin does not surprise, for everything is possible in this age of socialism. But is the spirit of curiosity dead? If so, that will be the end of all things. Surely everybody cannot be murdered or afraid to come out. Surely we shall light upon at least one brand from the burning, some pathetic, interested spectator. If it were but a man drunk in the gutter. Yes, it's rum, agreed his companion. But listen, I think I hear a noise over there to the right. Shall we go and see? Tony stopped, friendliness in his heart. "I think you're right," he said, "but look here. Judging by what we've seen, these chaps won't stick at trifles. Personally, I don't much care what happens, so long as I can get interested, but you're different. You're an older man. Hadn't you better try the station?" The little man blushed. "Damn it, sir," he began and then stopped. "I beg your pardon. I haven't sworn these 20 years, but I feel somehow different today. What I mean is that I'm not a greybeard yet, and if you can be interested, I can. Come on." "All right," said Tony, warming to him. "Awfully sorry I said that. I say, you are a sportsman." The other blushed again, but this time with pleasure. "Thank you. That is the second time I have been called a sportsman within 24 hours. I rather like it, mister. By the way, have you any objection to telling me your name?" "Not a bit, if you'll tell me yours." The little man considered a moment, and then, "My name is Hedderwick," he said frankly. "I feel I can trust you to keep your own counsel. Of course, mine is Tony Wilde." They had been walking quickly in the direction of the noise, which every minute became clearer. At last, guided by their ears, they entered a street where their curiosity was satisfied. At the farther end was a seething crowd of men, a few women, and a rabble of gutter children. They were the strikers, or some of them, all excited and not a few drunk. As the guard had said, they were evidently somewhat out of hand, and the looting of the public houses had not tended to assuage their wrath. Fired by their alleged grievances, liquor, eloquence, and the electricity of a mob, they had spent the last few hours in wrecking the town. The police had done all that was possible to stem the attack and vindicate law and order, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Reinforcements and soldiers had been telegraphed for, and were even now marching, but for the time being, the local forces had retired to talk over the return match and exchange of lint and arnica. The strikers were in possession and thoroughly enjoying themselves. Tony, whispering to his companion, "Keep close, and don't get into arguments. Pretend to be a labour leader if you like," pushed his way slowly through the crowd. Robert, his heart bumping with fear, interest and excitement, followed him. He was afraid, but not too afraid, and he felt that his holiday was proving a success. When they reached the centre of interest, after a tardy but good-humoured progress, they were rewarded with a sight neither had hoped for. The thickest of the crowd was swaying round a large shop. It was termed the Emporium, and almost merited the title. The happy anarchs had smashed every atom of the plate glass, careless of the ratepayers, and then had proceeded to abolish such of the fittings as offended their aesthetic sense. In the centre of the window space, standing on a chair, was a cheerful striker, conducting a kind of auction. More strictly, it was a charitable distribution, for no one made any effort to pay for the goods received. The shop was a miniature Whiteley's, embracing everything from a perambulator to a parachute, and it was odd to watch the incongruity of some of the articles distributed. One man, for example, was given a child's feeding bottle, and accepted it without demur. With a bellow of approval he seized it by the rubber tube and whirled it round, shouting, till the tube broke and the bottle flew off at a tangent. Another received half a pianola. The whole was too much for him to carry, and kindly friends helped him to bisect it with clubs and bars. A third, bemused with beer, staggered off with a dozen volumes of comparative religion, murmuring brokenly. Suthin for the kids to read, and dropping at intervals his burden in the mud. It was a pleasant illustration of good feeling and unselfishness. A few moments after Tony and Robert had penetrated to the front, ready-made clothing was being distributed with a lavish hand. The auctioneer would seize a suit, or a part of a suit, from the nearest peg, and with humorous or profane comments throw it to one of the crowd. "Who wants a waistcoat?" He was crying presently. "A regular fancy article, double wove, stamped on every bleeding yard. Just the thing to fetch the girls. Just the thing to wear of a Sunday. And when the bloom's off you can use it as an earth rug or a tea cosy. Just the thing. Here y'are." And he flung it to an outstretched hand. "Now's our chance if we want to change," whispered Robert. He meant it as a joke, and trembled as he saw Tony's face light up with amusement. "Don't be a fool," he whispered at once. "These chaps are simply mad." "Could you oblige me with a suit?" asked Tony suavely, but in the clearest tones. The crowd turned at the university accent. Hitherto they had been too busy to notice the new arrival, but as they observed the opera hat, the smart broadcloth and starched linen, they recognized the presence of one of the upper classes and looked black. A murmur arose, growing in strength and hostility, and a voice suggested with painful clarity the dissection of his internal organs. Tony took in the situation, another minute, and grumbling threats might be exchanged for action of an unpleasant kind. There was not a moment to lose. "Let me show you a thing, comrades," he said brightly, and before the smouldering raft could burst into flame, he took off his hat and smote it. The fabric collapsed with a ridiculous clop, and the crowd, taken by surprise and ready to laugh at the mere trifle, roared. Tony spun it into the air with a careless grace, far over the heads of the throng, and as all eyes were fixed on its trajectory, he pushed his way forward. "A moment, please," he urged, shouldering on toward the shop. "By your leave, sir." "Excuse me, friend." "Beg pardon, brother." And behold, he was standing beside the auctioneer. The latter glared his enmity, refusing to budge, but Tony took no heed. All trace of boredom gone, his eyes aglow with eagerness, he gesticulated for silence. The strikers, not wholly recovered from their surprise, postponed, at least for the time being, the suggested vivisection and waited for Tony to justify himself. He was a fluent speaker and lost no time in beginning. "Comrades," he cried, "you see me as I am. I am in the unhappy position of being without a hat and in evening dress. Unlooked for events put me in a train this morning, and it was not until the train had started that I realized my absurd costume. What was I to do? Chance settled the question. Chance brought me here into your delightful neighborhood, and what do I find? A good fairy, as it were, distributing clothes for nothing." At this point, a voice called for cheers for the fairy, which were heartily given. The fairy, unused to badinage, retired from the rostrum, and Tony was quick to jump up. "You see, comrades, that I got a rise. May you soon get the same. May you get what you are asking for." A tornado of cheers covered his corollary, viz. 6 months hard uttered in an undertone. Feeling was shifting a little in his favour now, and he swept on. "Here, I thought, is my opportunity. I am an outcast, dressed in the ridiculous garb civilization imposes on her sons, the pampered scions of the aristocracy. You have seen me discard my allegiance to the dukes. The crushing of the hat was symbolical. I hate the petty trammels of the curled and scented darlings of the rich. If you wish, if you will allow me to annex one of the admirable and useful suits of reach, me, Downs, 9 and 11 halfpenny off the peg, I will discard the remnants of an obsolete feudalism. My coat shall go. My waistcoat? Even a prude cried. Shame! Tony seized upon the word like a practised ranter. Yes, he cried warmly. It is a shame that I should be forced to wear these loathsome garments when self-respect urges me to assume a manlier garb. May I take it that I have your assent? I put it to the meeting that I forthwith state, take what I want. He paused for breath, but they were dumb before this extraordinary creature. He hurried on, carried unanimously. Thank you, comrades, for this mark of appreciation and esteem. Behold. He tore off his coat and waistcoat and trod upon them. See how I trample the badge of servitude, observe. He discarded his nether apparel, knowing that he could not stick at trifles. The crowd's mood might turn if he gave it time. Luckily, his audacity was rewarded, for the audience roared with brutal joy at Tony's remarkable appearance. Without hesitation, he snatched a suit from several that hung at hand, selecting the quietest he could see, talking furiously as he put it on. And what now? See! A transformation! A man clothed in sensible dress! Hurrah for the social revolution! Hurrah for communizing the means of production and distribution, especially distribution, and all the rest of the dear old claptrap, he added sotto voce as he leaped nimbly down. In the thunderous applause that followed the impassioned harangue, Tony slipped his arms through Mr. Hedderwick's, and they were allowed to make good their escape. They walked in silence till they were clear of the crowd, and then Robert paused. "Mr. Wilde, you were simply splendid," he said in awestruck tones. "You're one of the best chaps I've ever met." Tony chuckled, tired but pleased. "And not a bad effort, was it? But, by Jove, I was in a funk half the time." "So was I," confessed Robert. "I began to think I might have to use this." He pulled a revolver out of his pocket and showed it. Tony crowed with pure joy. "Good Lord, man, you've got a pistol." "How perfectly splendid. What on earth do you carry a pistol for? Do tell me, please." Mr. Hedderwick walked on in silence for a minute, evidently weighing some problem. Presently he gave a gulp of decision. "Mr. Wilde," he said, "I haven't known you very long, but I seem to have known you for years. What I've seen has interested me, impressed me, and I like you. You know a little about me, that I'm off for a holiday on unusual lines, but unless you agree to my proposal, I shan't tell you any more. You, it appears, are a free agent, young, with nothing to do. I think we might enjoy ourselves much more together than apart. In any case, if we found it didn't suit, we could separate. If you feel like adventuring for a few days, I think there may be a little fun. I can't promise it, but I think so. If you agree, I'll tell you the rest when we get to the Happy Heart. One question, said Tony, and don't be offended. Do you want any money? Mr. Hedderwick thought for a moment and frowned. Then he smiled. I have 2 and 8 in my pocket, he said frankly. I came out in a hurry. I could get more if I wanted, but I don't mean to try, for I have no wish to be traced yet. I'm not a cadger or a confidence, trickster. If you care to finance me till we return, so much the better for me. If not, well, I'll do without and rough it somehow. I don't mean to miss my holiday. Tony smiled. This Hedderwick seemed an admirable fellow. What and where is the Happy Heart? He asked. An inn at Sherling where I mean to stay. Forward then to the Happy Heart. I wish I'd bags and boots too. These pumps are simply cruel. They set out once more toward the station. Chapter 11. A TTH Happy Heart. The landlord of the Happy Heart stood leaning against his door, post, smoking a churchwarden. He was enjoying his tobacco in the summer morning, and occasionally directing a bovine thought to the identity of the solitary guest at present lying in bed upstairs. The said guest had arrived 2 days before with a view to golf, for the Sherling links were well known. The Happy Heart was rarely without a golf enthusiast, since it was the only inn in Sherling, the local squire, at present yachting, owning most of the land in the neighbourhood, and refusing to let his village become an abiding place for tourists. Wherefore the neighbouring town of Dallingham, 6 miles distant, reaped a golden harvest, and its hotels were out of all proportion to its population. The guest upstairs, to return to the landlord's vaguely moving thoughts, was a man well over 70, but active for his age. An olive complexion hinted that he was no Briton, but the testimony of the greenkeepers went to prove that his English was fluent, and of the magnitude of his tips the odd jogman of the Happy Heart could not say enough. A man of 70 may be excused for showing reserve or desiring quiet, and the landlord did not think it curious that the visitor divided his time between the links and his bedroom. The man was certainly a gentleman, perhaps an aristocrat, and there was no doubt that his money was good. The only thing that bothered the landlord was, why had he brought no servant? It did not occur to him that solitude to the great may be worth more than the benignities of a valet. The landlord shaded his eyes with a browned hand and looked down the road. There was nothing to be seen. With an effort that was mental as well as physical, he turned himself upon the axis of the door, post, and blinked in the other direction. Here the figure of a man rewarded him, walking steadily but without hurry toward the inn. One of they golfing chaps from the station, was the landlord's first thought. He must be mortal keen to come so early. His mild surprise changed to blank amazement as the stranger drew near. Top hat, gloves, etc., he muttered, a swell and all. What's he doing of here? He was still ruminating when the stranger halted, surveyed the tavern sign, and entered. The landlord followed him into the parlour. "A quart of beer, please," said Lionel, sitting down with relish on the nearest bench. The landlord, his surprise in no way lessened by the order, went and drew the beer. He placed it before his customer, and then said, "You're early astir, sir?" 10 o'clock early," said Lionel. "I thought that country people called that late. Not if you come by train, sir, as I suppose you did. A friend of mine, Jeggs the farmer, drove by here 20 minutes agone. He said that the first train, the 5 o'clock, had only just come in, being delayed by the strikers." "I suppose you came by that?" "Yes," said Lionel, "I did." "And did you see anything of the strike, sir?" "No," said Lionel, "I stayed in the train. In fact, I slept all the way, being tired." The landlord, seeing that the other was in no communicative mood, withdrew after begging him to ring the bell if he wanted further refreshment. Lionel, left to the kindly solitude of the parlour, put up his legs on the bench with a sigh of relief, took a draught of the beer, and lighted a pipe. He was very tired, in spite of the sleep he had spoken of. With the exception of that brief and disturbed period in the train, he had not slept for some 26 hours, and in addition, he had been through sundry diverting experiences. The successful burglary had been a strain, and after he and Beatrice had got back to the flat, they had spent the next 3 hours in discussing and planning. They had searched every room, nook and cranny for some trace of Mizzy, some clue as to where she might have flown. Of course it was useless, not a scrap of paper. Not a single compromising document rewarded their efforts. Only some blackened ashes in the bedroom grate hinted at possibilities. She had left nearly all her clothes and personal belongings, and her boxes were unlocked as if to invite inspection. She had simply disappeared, gone, like one in a melodrama, out into the night. It was of the utmost importance to trace her, but what could be done? It was obvious that detectives should not be employed, for a hint of official interference might mean the death of Lucas. Beatrice and Lionel must do their own detection, and they spent their brains on the problem, apparently so hopeless. Even the cause of Mizzie's disloyalty was anything but clear. It might be that she was in the pay of the Sultan, or it might be that she wished to be revenged. But why revenge? Beatrice, with a twinkle that made Lionel feel qualms of conscience, suggested jealousy, but the suggestion was thrown out in such an airy spirit that he felt she did not really believe in it. He himself preferred to believe, and did believe, that the more sensational hypothesis should be adopted. She must be a spy who meant to get a good price for the famous papers. But why had she not stolen them before? Perhaps she had been in treaty with the enemy, but had failed to get the terms she wanted. It did not seem adequate, but it was the only solution they could suggest. Assuming, then, that she had stolen the papers to make money, what would be her first step? Beatrice, and Lionel agreed with her, thought that she was too clever to deal with underlings. She would go as near to the fountainhead as she could, to the Turkish ambassador himself, for he was a known adherent of the old regime. She would go as soon as possible, the next morning. That is, about the present, what time Lionel was drinking beer in the Happy Heart. But a dim recollection was beating in the brain of Beatrice that she had seen something of importance in the society news of a few days past. They searched the flat for every newspaper, and at last found the sheet they wanted. Hope beating at the doors, they scanned the column that Lionel never read, but that Beatrice studied first. Yes, there it was, the justification of her memory for seeming trivialities. His Excellency, the Turkish ambassador has gone for a few days' golf to Sherling. Beatrice threw the paper away in flushed triumph, thought deeply for a few moments, and then said, "You must go there. Mizzie may follow and try to succeed at Sherling. Watch and do the best you can. I shall stay in London in case I am wrong and keep an eye on the embassy. If she is at Sherling, try to get the treaty. I must leave you to work on your own lines. If I hear anything, I shall wire to the local inn. Will you?" "Of course," he said. "Yes. Is there anything else? Money? No, do not protest. This is life and death, and both cost money." She ran to a little safe and returned, her hands full. "Here are notes for £100 or more. You may have to bribe. Do not refuse. It is for Lucas." Lionel longed to say, "Madam, my life and fortune are at your disposal. Let there be no mention of money between us." But seeing that his stock of ready cash had dwindled to 2p, halfpenny, he had bought a packet of 10 cigarettes the day before and now cursed the extravagance, he could only say, "As you will." "Thank you," she said softly, and laid her hand on his head. He thrilled, and she administered a necessary antidote. "It is for Lucas." "Oh, hang Lucas!" He groaned in spirit, and then in swift repentance his thoughts mumbled, "No, no, bless Lucas, dear old Lucas, poor old chap." After this there had been nothing but idle conversation until the hour of his departure approached. Once Beatrice fell into a fit of musing, and presently she said, "What a fool I was to tell Mizzie." A younger man might have said, "Not at all, it was perfectly natural." Lionel, older, more self-reliant, and more honest, replied simply, "We all make mistakes," for he thought her folly almost incredible. She felt this. They were more than sympathiques, and said, "Ah, if you knew! I was very lonely one night, lonely and sad. I had to talk to someone and believed her a true friend. You can imagine my self-reproach." He could, and felt himself more than justified in pressing her hand. Presently there had been some suspense, for when the time came for him to leave the flat, at 4:30, Beatrice had peeped from the window and imagined that she saw a man watching the house. Lionel peeped too, but could see nothing. Nevertheless, they had waited another 10 minutes, as long as they dared if he was to catch the first train. But at length he resolved to risk a spy, and after a brief, tense but outwardly calm goodbye, he had left the house. By taking a cab he reached Euston in time, and at last was established in the train. So far as he knew, he had not been followed. The only stranger he had noticed had been a man who was in the train before he was on the platform, so from him there could be nothing to fear. And now he was in the Happy Heart, resting after a dusty 3-mile walk from Sherling Station, drinking good English beer, far from all thought of Oriental craft and scheming. He was in Sherling, on the second stage of his fond adventure. What was to be the first step? In spite of the rest and beer he felt discontented, and glumly wished that Beatrice were at hand. To what end? To advise, direct, console, or soothe? He hardly knew, but darkly suspected that it was for the weaker reason. Idly he allowed himself to remember the touch of her delightful fingers, cool, nervous and alluring, the seduction of her hair, the brilliant command of her eyes. But it was not these only that inspired his grateful remembrance. It was also her lovely personality, her courage, her charm, herself. Of course it could not be love, that was absurd. It was a flame kindled by the sympathy of a comrade, the kind of comrade he had never known. Possibly the fact that he had not enjoyed any extensive woman, friendships during the recent years had made him exaggerate her qualities. She might be rare, but could she be so rare as he thought her? Supposing he met some other delightful woman soon, might not the pleasant image of Beatrice lose something of its lustre? He shook himself impatiently. It was a foolish thought. Other women might be delightful, charming, desirable, but there could only be a single Beatrice. How pretty she was, how— And here the figure of Lucas beckoned a grim warning. "It is time you put your shoulder to the wheel, my friends." "All right, old chap, all right," said Lionel petulantly to the shade. "Don't be in such a beastly hurry. It's not love, I tell you, just a superlative esteem for your splendid wife, your wife," he added with a martyr's sigh. And then he raised the tankard, feeling that it ought to hold to Kay. "Here's to her," he murmured, drinking deep. He put the pewter down, but raised it again. "And to you, old chap," he added generously. "Hello, there's none left, beg pardon." As he finished, the door opened and admitted a chubby little clergyman, who sat down with a courteous "Good morning." Lionel made haste to remove his legs from the bench. The landlord followed close upon the heels of the newcomer. "Morning, sir," said the landlord respectfully. "Will you take anything? Draught cider?" "Half a pint," said the clergyman briskly. The landlord disappeared, and he turned, smiling. "You should try the cider of the happy heart," he said. "That is, if you have not done so already. I allow myself that as a concession to the flesh." "And a sensible concession too," replied Lionel heartily. He was pleased that a gentleman in holy orders did not think it undignified to drink in a common pub. "I have been drinking beer, and very good it is, or was, but I must try the cider if I remain here." "Staying long?" asked the other pleasantly. And when Lionel said guardedly that he had not quite settled yet, the clergyman did not pursue the question, but passed on to other themes. "I am the local parson," he said chattily. "My name is Peters." As he spoke, the landlord came back with the clerical cider and a telegram. "Does your name happen to be Mortimer, sir?" he asked. "Because if so, this here telegram is for you." "It is," said Lionel in some surprise. The wire could only be from Beatrice, but he had not expected any communication from her as yet. With a brief apology, he opened the yellow envelope and read its contents. It was all he could do to keep from betraying his astonishment. The wire read as follows: "Hope you had pleasant journey. My suspicions deepen. Try, stay Arkwright twin, suspect even her. Wait further wire. Blair." He read the telegram 3 times, but it was not till the third reading that he grasped the import of Arkwright twin. He knew no one of the name of Arkwright, nor had he ever claimed acquaintance with a twin. "The nearest I could do is triplets," he thought. "Johnson of the house was a triplet, I remember, but that's no good to me. Who on earth?" And then he recalled Beatrice saying that she had a twin sister who had disapproved of her stage career. Of course it must be she. He had been so accustomed to think of his preceptress as Beatrice Blair that he had almost forgotten it must be a stage name. And so she was really an Arkwright, rather a pretty name on the whole, though unworthy of her high claims. Failing Beatrice Blair, it ought to have been Rosalind. Rosalind what? Rosalind Roy. Rosalind Gay. Rosalind Ebbsfleet. Rosalind Wise. He smiled as his thoughts played with a score of dainty conceits. He was roused to common sense and depression by the remembrance that she was really Mrs. Lucas. But was Lucas a surname? Let's hope not, he reflected sourly. "No bad news, I trust," said the chubby clergyman, with a polite but ecclesiastical inflection. "No, no," answered Lionel abruptly. He abandoned Rosalind completely and tried to arrange his thoughts. By the way, do you happen to know anyone of the name of Arkwright in the neighbourhood? The chubby clergyman looked interested. I do and I don't, he said, pulling his chair close to the table and leaning on his elbows. A Miss Arkwright lives at the quiet house. She has been the tenant for only 2 months, and nobody has seen her yet. What? It sounds odd, said the clergyman, with the smile of one who has an interesting story for a virgin audience. But it is true. She calls on nobody and denies herself to every caller. She is never seen in the village except when driving in her motor, and I am sorry to say that she does not come to church. But surely something is known of her, through the servants, for instance. She has a housekeeper, I believe, who makes friends with nobody, a dumb gardener and a dumb footman. A little extraordinary, eh? He rubbed his hands with zest. But it is true nonetheless. Of course, all sorts of gossip have been greedily accepted. I never listen to gossip. One has to think of one's position, but some things cannot be hid. They say she takes motor drives at night, every night. I do not credit the every. Exaggeration is so prevalent. I always believe less than half what the villagers tell me. That is, what drifts round to my ears. But what does she do all day? Asked Lionel. Clearly this was a queer state of affairs. I do not know. Her grounds are large. Perhaps she gardens. You do not think there is any fear of a scandal? Asked Lionel in a pained voice, anxious not to wound. I trust not. I trust not. I have no reason to think. Of course, things do look odd, and my wife says, but no, I am sure she must be wrong. I hope so. Mrs. Peters has heard, hazarded Lionel. The clergyman shook his head with dignity. Nothing. Nothing. My wife called, but was refused admittance. Naturally she, as the vicar's wife, felt a little hurt. Of course, agreed Lionel. But no other friends come? Nobody in motors? I believe not. I should have heard. It would have drifted round to me in the course of time. Nobody stays here, I suppose? Oh yes, golfers. One is here now, an excellent man, old and of foreign origin, I believe. He calls himself Beckett, but he has told me, in confidence, that he is here for rest, incognito. He may be somebody of importance. An excellent man, however. He gave me a guinea for our restoration fund the day I showed him the church. The ambassador, was Lionel's swift conclusion, and then aloud, has he been here long? 3 days. For golf. We have played a few rounds. He smiled at some hidden joy. He is not very good, for even I can give him a stroke a hole. Uncommunicative. Very, but interesting. A gentleman. And I should say a seeker. Ah, said Lionel, getting up. Well, I must go on. Can you tell me how to find the quiet house? The other gasped. You are going to call. He recollected himself and apologized. I beg your pardon, but go straight down the road, the prettiest house on the right. By the way, if you are staying here, I should be happy to take you round the links. Or show you the church. Thank you, said Lionel. You were very good, but I don't know how long I shall be staying. Well, come round and smoke a pipe after dinner, suggested the clergyman, his eagerness to secure one who knew Miss Arkwright was poorly disguised. I would say come and dine, but Mrs. Peters. He left it to be understood that Mrs. Peters' permission must first be obtained. Lionel could hardly restrain a smile. Thank you, he said. I cannot promise yet, but I will remember. Goodbye. He left Mr. Peters rejoicing over a fresh piece of news that had drifted round, which he meant to retail to his wife at the earliest opportunity. As he sat down again to finish his modest allowance, Tony Wilde and Mr. Hedderwick made an unobtrusive appearance. They had watched Lionel turn the corner before approaching, for Robert was not anxious to meet his late visitor by daylight. "Good morning, sir," said Tony. He turned to his friend. "What's yours? Mine is beer, and lots of it." "Mine's bed," said Robert, and sat down with a yawn. Chapter 12. Crossed orbits. There are few things more restful than watching other people working hard, and the sensation is doubly piquant when one is sitting in the shade watching the worker toiling beneath the sun. Mrs. Peters was sitting in the shade, and though she would have denied the suggestion of idleness, for was she not picking the names of likely helpers for the imminent bazaar? It was not unpleasant to observe Brown, the odd job man, mowing the lawn. He seemed willing, though of course you must remember he had been taken on only 2 days ago, and besides, knew that the mistress had her eye on him, sober too, refusing beer in favour of lemonade. But there. That might be hypocrisy, for there is always something, and these quiet men are often worse than the patently unsteady. Probably he gambled. Still, at present he was undeniably working, and he had sense enough to oil the machine every quarter of an hour. The vicarage lawn was big enough for 2 tennis courts, with a little over for croquet and miniature or clock golf. It took, theoretically, an able-bodied man an hour and a half to run the machine over it. The optimistic phrase was the vicar's, who had not run the machine, or its predecessors, for 20 years. A succession of practical runners made the sum come out differently, and one rebellious soul. Of course, my dear, a radical chapel-goer had invited his employer to shove the qualified mower himself and see if he could do it in a qualified hour and a half. The sporting offer was not accepted, but the idealistic standard maintained. It was, in fact, a grass-cutting bogey who had never been beaten yet. "Be careful, Brown," said Mrs. Peters, preparatory to a departure indoors, "to gather up all the grass and put it in the sack. It looks so untidy if you leave any lying about." "Yes, ma'am," said Brown respectfully. "I'll be sure to do so. I ought to finish in half an hour or so." "Less if you work, Brown," said Mrs. Peters reprovingly. She knew he had been mowing for little over an hour, but discipline must be kept up. Besides, does not Browning say, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp," or "What's a heaven for?" Without waiting for possible protests, she went into the house. The odd job man smiled. "She's all right," he said softly to no one in particular. "Oh, law, yes, she's all right." He whistled softly, but without obvious discontent, and made a change in his labours. Giving the machine a well-earned rest, he began to gather up the cut grass from a square of canvas that lay extended on the ground and stuffed it into the sack referred to by Mrs. Peters. This task brought him near the tall privet hedge, reinforced by a 4-foot paling which sheltered the vicarage garden from the road. He had hardly accounted for a dozen armfuls when a voice from the other side of the hedge said, "Good morning." Regardless of Mrs. Peters' late instructions, the odd job man dropped a generous portion of grass and stood transfixed. "So you've come," he said quietly, but distinctly. "For goodness' sake, let's have a look at your pretty face." The privet hedge parted, and a damsel of 23 smiled upon the gratified Brown. "Is that better?" she asked. "A lots," replied the odd job man, pressing closer to the hedge. "But I tell you what would be better still—" "Yes?" "I shall have to whisper it." The damsel, full of innocent curiosity, bent forward to listen. The odd job man, congratulating himself on extraordinary cunning, bent forward and essayed a kiss of welcome. The intended recipient, however, seemed to be possessed of a sixth sense or instinct, for, when his lips were on the point of meeting hers, she drew back with a melodious cry of surprise. The kiss was too late to be checked, and unhappily was bestowed upon a bunch of privet. The odd job man mildly whispered the equivalent of "How very annoying!" and then remonstrated in a louder tone. He pointed out that he had not seen his visitor for a week, and that under the circumstances the least she could do, and so on. "Yes," agreed the damsel, parting the hedge once more. "It is true, all that you say. But you forget that you have not earned it yet." "Holy Moses," said the odd job man, appealing to the heavens. "Here, I chuck my job in London at a word, or rather a letter from you. I come down here got up as a labourer, I hang about the blessed village till I'm sick for the town, and you again, I get taken on here to work. And mind you, it is work, though I don't grumble at that. And it's all for to keep an eye on a chap I've never seen. And not for me. You silly Chew, I beg your pardon, miss. That is, my dear, what I do mean is, who are you getting at? Of course, it's for you, and I'm going through with it. But I do think you might give me a bit of encouragement, like, when you come at last." He paused. There was the sound of steps coming down the road, and he had no wish to be overheard courting. Thus drawn back to real life, conscience pricked him, and he wondered if there was any danger of Mrs. Peters reappearing. In a panic, he looked over his shoulder. No, the lawn was deserted, he still had time. But when he turned to the hedge, he was surprised to see his love with her head pushed right through the privet, scarlet from excitement. A hand, too, appeared, enjoining caution and silence. He must have recognised ere this that Brown, the odd job man beneath the thrall of Mrs. Peters, was none other than Mr. Henry Brown, cab proprietor, under different auspices. You will remember, then, the type of man he was but a few chapters ago, middle-aged, reserved, cautious, and a little unenterprising. But you will not forget that love had made a change in his habits, outlook and Ellen. He was younger now, more alert, audacious and full of guile. So you must not be surprised that when he saw his lady beckoning, appealing to him to come closer, be careful, not talk but observe. When he saw her head, and it was a very pretty head, framed in harmonious privet, when he saw this gift of fortune, You must not be surprised that he accepted it. He drew near and kissed her very quietly but very heartily. She, for some obscure reason wishing to remain unseen, did not dare to withdraw her head or box his ears. All she could do was to bite her lip and stamp her dainty heel while she remained, ostrich-like, in the hedge. The footsteps passed, but before they began to grow fainter, Henry Brown repeated the salutation. "Couldn't help it," he said meekly, answering the sparkle in her eyes. "You shouldn't tempt a man. Now, what's the row?" She was too excited to rebuke him. The moment was too precious to be lost. "You see him?" she queried, pointing to the retreating figure of Lionel, who was on the road to the quiet house. "Well, that is the man you are to watch. That is he from whom you are to recover the document." "The deuce it is," said Henry, gazing after Lionel with interest. "Well, he's big enough to give trouble. You are not afraid?" "Not particularly," he said with a slow smile. "It's not a job I hanker after, but I've promised you to try, and I will try. You'll tell me, I dare say, what you think the best way of setting about it. Of course, you are far too stupid to think for yourself. And now, goodbye. I say, you're not going. And I had such a lot to talk about, that wedding, for instance." "What wedding?" She paused, chin in air. "Come. That's a good un. Ours. PS2. The assurance of these male creatures. As if I would marry a man who kisses me by force. Oh, Mr. Brown, do not count on that. Do what you have promised first, and then I will think about it. If I choose, well. If I do not choose, well, I promise nothing." "That's a poor sort of bargain." "It is no bargain. I do not bargain. I give an order. Goodbye. Oh, I will write to you." Thank you, he began. "To tell you what to do. I shall not be far, but you must not attempt to see me without my leave." She turned on her heel and marched down the road. The odd job man whistled in amused dismay. "They're all alike," he muttered, as he turned to his work again and met the vicar's wife. She was coming from the house and wore a severe expression. "Did I hear you talking, Brown?" "I can't say, ma'am," he answered stolidly. She frowned. "Be good enough not to equivocate," she commanded. "Were you talking?" "I often talk aloud to myself," said Henry mildly. He was an honest man and did not take kindly to lies even of the whitest. Mrs. Peters frowned again. "Indeed," she said icily. "Do you mean to say you were not talking to a young woman through the hedge?" "Yes, ma'am," said Henry. "I was. I suppose I'm allowed to rest for a minute now and then." "Rest is a very different thing from philandering. That I cannot allow. It looks very bad from the road to see the vicarage servants gossiping, or worse through the hedge. Remember, Brown, it must not happen again." "I cannot understand one of our village girls." She paused interrogatively, but Henry was not so silly as to fall into the trap. He began to oil the machine, and even Mrs. Peters did not like to ask point-blank who his sweetheart was. Instead, she finished with a snap. "Making herself so cheap." She went back to the house again. Henry straightened up and glared after her. "They're all alike," he said again. But how he could include two such different people as Mrs. Peters and his adored in the same condemnation is hard to understand. The words of the sentence, it is true, were identical, but the inflection hinted at a great gulf fixed between the two offenders. Possibly they were charged with different offences. They're all alike, are they? Does the same essential lurk beneath the surface? Supposing we could dissect Mrs. Peters, Alicia, Mizzy, Beatrice Blair, and 1,000 Ermintrudes or Sallys, should we find the same germ of woman? Take Lionel's evidence, if it were available. You might safely assert that to him Beatrice was different from and superior to any other woman you could produce. Henry Brown would as stoutly hold the same of his anonymous sweetheart. Mr. Peters and Mr. Hedderwick, we may hope, would take an identical line, or at least they would have once. But these are, or have been, lovers, the blindest of mortals, and their evidence is too partial to be trustworthy. A cynic like Pope would tell you that every woman is at heart a rake, and might find a score of others to support him. A Shaw might produce a monster like Anne Whitfield and brazenly say she was typical. A Chesterton would talk of women being sublime as individuals but horrible in a herd. A son might say that his mother was perfect, but he too would be partial. What is the truth about woman? Only a woman can say, and she would find it hard to take a detached view. Probably truth was partly expressed by the odd job man in words, wholly expressed by his words and inflection. They are human and feminine if you probe deep enough, but there are variations, unimagined harmonies and discords for the seeker. They're all alike, with a difference, and no man can learn the whole truth from a textbook. The textbook can give him elementary rules which may serve him well, but he must be prepared to find plenty of exceptions. The student, however, need not fear monotony. But while we have been indulging in cheap philosophy, Mr. Brown's sweetheart has got well down the road, following at a considerable distance the footsteps of Lionel. Evidently she is in a good humour with the world, for she hums an air that has a sprightly sound as of the boulevards or cabarets, and she stops to pick a wild rose. She is smiling at her thoughts, possibly at the lamentable lack of self-control exhibited by her lover, possibly at the remembrance of the grass still to be mown and neatly gathered. And as she is in a good humour, self-possessed, and the air is of the balmiest, is it wonderful that she should smile absently on a good-looking stranger sitting by the roadside, smoking a cigarette? Surely not, as the stranger is Tony Wilde, who has left Mr. Hedderwick exhausted at the Happy Heart while he strolls out to examine the lie of the land. "Good morning," says Tony courteously, raising his cap. He does not get up, for that might frighten her away. "Can you tell me which is the road to Hetonley Hole?" "Forgive me asking, but—" "I have never heard of it," says the lady, with a smile that shows she penetrates Tony's elementary artifice. "I am sorry. Good morning." Tony deliberately flicks the ash from his cigarette. "What a bore," he observes with a fluent laziness in his voice, and of course the lady cannot continue her progress while he is speaking. "It would look so prudish. I was awfully keen on seeing Hetonley Hole, but nobody here seems to know the road, so I suppose I shall have to give up the idea. I say, don't you find life rather a bore?" It was an abrupt change of subject, but there seemed no inconsequence as the words dropped idly from his lips. He appeared to be talking at random for an obvious purpose, but with an unaffected sincerity. Nothing to do, I mean, and not a vast amount to see. One day following another, and so forth, you know. "Heavens, no," replied the lady with an amused contempt. "There is so much to see, to ask, to think about. What can a young man like you think of himself if he is bored at 26? "Good shot," said Tony. "I say, please forgive me being so forward and pushing and all that, and do sit down and talk to me. I should be tremendously gratified, and I'd do my best to amuse you." "I have stayed too long already," she said with a crisp note of rebuke. "I have neither the time nor the wish to stop and relieve the tedium of bored strangers. I hope you will soon find the road you speak of." She turned and went on her way. Tony smiled good-naturedly. Really, she had been quite lenient, though he had hardly deserved all she said and implied. She was more than pretty, and was evidently no fool. A lady, and no, but was it worth following up? Should he try to engineer a small flirtation, or be content with the fair promises held out by Mr. Hedderwick? No, yes. She had spurned his lightly, proffered homage to her charms, and a more propre would not allow him to give in without a struggle. He was only too willing in most things to step aside of his own free will. Things so soon lost their interest, but to be forced to play the part of rejected spectator that could not be permitted. His eyes followed her smilingly. "I bet she turns and waves," thought the despicable Tony. "She's a charming lady's maid who likes fun, respects herself, and means to be treated with correctness when she chooses. She will turn and wave before reaching that bend in the road, and I will be standoffish and refuse to reply. A perfect cause of offence, with a delightful misunderstanding to follow. But I shall follow her secretly along the hedge and find out where she lives. Admirable." She had gone some little distance, but still did not turn round. Worshippers of beauty, modesty, good feeling, and decorous behaviour, rejoice. She did not turn round. Her gay svelte figure marched bravely along, virginal defiance in her shoulders, and the swing of her tailor made skirt. The fragments of a gallant whistle floated back to Tony, and he murmured, "Bravado," with an uneasy doubt. The curve of the road was close at hand now. A few more yards would carry her past in triumph, and the sex be vindicated. Tony was in painful agitation, for his knowledge of woman and powers of swift diagnosis were at stake. 3 yards were left. 2, hope seemed dead. Then, alas! She stopped, and a smile crept to his lips. But she did not turn round. There is still a loophole for the sex. She did not turn round. All she did was to open her reticule and take her handkerchief from it. As the handkerchief was withdrawn, a bit of pasteboard was caught in its folds and fell, on the road. Tony waited with vast contentment until she had turned the corner. Then with a light heart he followed and picked up the card. He read the inscription with amused curiosity. It was, Miss Arkwright, The Quiet House. Chapter 13. Rather stagey. After Beatrice had bidden Lionel goodbye in the early dawn, she did the most sensible thing possible. She went to bed. But it is one thing to go to bed, and another to go to sleep, as many a sufferer, from insomnia, love, indigestion, or kindred ailments, has found to his cost. You feel weary, oppressed with the want of sleep, let us say, yawnsome, in a word, ready to drop off the moment you are between the sheets. But if a white night be inscribed in the book of fate, how change the mood as soon as the light is out? At once, almost, you lose that sense of impending slumber and become wide awake, clear-eyed and keen of brain. Something occurs to interest your mind, and you meditate perspicaciously thereon. Another thought succeeds, and another, and you grow more wakeful every moment. Soon you begin to say, I must go to sleep now, and resolutely try to refuse to think. But resolution is vain before insomnia. Eyelids may be tightly shut, but the masked eyeballs still peer vigilantly into the void. Hands may clench themselves in the hopeless effort to compose the will and induce the wished. For slumber, the alert body may strive to cheat itself by observing the accustomed ritual. First on the right side, then left, then right again. In the expectation of influencing mind by matter, droves of sheep may be counted passing through innumerable gates, poems recited till the very thought of verse revolts, numerals repeated by the ticking brain, but still you are far from the haven. It seems that not poppy, nor mandragora, nor all the drowsy syrups of the world could bestow the most blessed of all boons. And at last you give up the unequal struggle and try to make the best of it. Failing drugs, and one has to be a smart society lady, a broken man or woman for them. There are various palliatives. You may turn on the light and read till sleep comes with soothing fingers upon tired brows, or, if young and enterprising, you can go for a walk and see the dawn. Or sometimes an impromptu bedroom picnic, bread and cheese, and a bottle of beer raided thief-wise from the pantry, taking great care not to let the stairs creak and alarm the house, may have excellent results. These, and a score of similar expedients, may be recommended with assurance to the patient, and if they fail, at least they have passed an hour or so more pleasantly than in mere acquiescence. Beatrice lay awake, sorely against her will. She knew that sleep was what she needed, and would need still more within some 14 hours. The strain of acting, followed by her preposterous adventure at the magnanimous churchwarden's, had used up more of her nervous resources than was desirable. Sleep was therefore the obvious thing, but alas! It proved the impossible thing too, and she lay restless, aglow with thought, waiting impatiently for what she knew would not come. What did she think of during those hours of frenzied vision? Was it of Lucos, waiting in an eastern prison for the news that would set him free to join her? Was it her dead son, the little boy she had spoken of to Lionel, or Turkey, the land of her adoption, struggling for freedom, enmeshed with perils, the slave of diplomatic and selfish adventures? Her art, had it a place within those weary wheels of thought? Her success on the stage, the triumphs of the footlights? Illusory, but so real in seeming, so satisfying and complete. Or Lionel? Did he whip her straining fancies to a wilder effort toward the goal? Something of all these may have engaged her, for each was inextricably interwoven with the others. Lucos, Lionel, the Sultan, Mirza, the Hedderwicks, the ambassador, 100 minor characters, supers in the drama of her life, wheeled hither and thither, mocking, defying, questioning. The horrible lines of Wilde burned in letters of fire upon the wall. Slim shadows, hand in hand, about, in ghostly rout, they trod a saraband, and the damned grotesques made arabesques, like the wind upon the sand. Each must have had his place in the drama, but the important question was, who played the lead? Lucos or Lionel, honour and faith or inclination? Yet that is hardly a fair way of putting it. She must not define her interest as inclination, hinting at something more potent. Interest one may admit without qualification. Lionel had saved her life, was an attractive and pleasant young man, and had been her guest for a week. Of course, Beatrice was interested. She would have been hard or inhuman otherwise. But did her inclination show signs of becoming something more? Could she honestly say in the stereotyped phrase that he was nothing to her, nothing being the antithesis of everything? In that sense she could say it, for he was certainly not everything. But was nothing exact? Ah, at least she must have found comfort in the reflection that she had sent him away on an errand that would avert all danger if successfully carried out. She had been weak once or twice, but such a weakness may find a ready forgiveness, considering the circumstances and the expiation. Which of us, O censorious reader, would have been as strong as Beatrice? Still, she could not sleep, and for the present that outweighed all moral hesitations and scruples. At 7 o'clock she gave up the unequal contest, dressed and went out for a short walk. The air calmed her, and she gained a respite from the self-examination for an hour. Then, after making an effort to eat some breakfast, she sat down to smoke a cigarette and think again about Lionel. What was he like? The real man, the true Lionel. Was he a man to be trusted, a man to be relied on, the sort of man, so to speak, one would like, supposing it were possible, to marry? Lionel as a husband. Husband brought a smile, a blush and a frown to the face of Beatrice, and it is to be hoped that the shade of Lucos noticed the blush as well as the smile. Heavens, and I have only known him a week, thought Beatrice with self-chastisement. Besides, precisely. There are so many besideses in real life. But undoubtedly, and without any disloyalty to shades, living or otherwise, he was the dearest of boys. He had behaved extraordinarily well throughout. Extraordinarily well, for actresses have unique opportunities of studying man's weakness. Not only in the cab and the dressing-room, but during the week of voluntary imprisonment. Polished, controlled, devoted without being tiresome, he was certainly the dearest of boys. Human, too, and humanity was a quality that appealed to Beatrice, nor did he lack a sense of humour and romance. But she had only known him for a week, and could she possibly form an adequate judgment in such a period? He may be acting all the time, she thought with a dismal pucker of the forehead, and I ought to know how easy it can be to act. What a fool I am to worry over things. She threw away the half-smoked cigarette with a petulant gesture and continued to worry. The remembrance of Mizzy flashed across her mind, her prettiness and Lionel's evasive declarations. These had been glib enough, no doubt, but glibness and dexterity were not sufficient to lull the suspicions of Beatrice. He is a man, she argued angrily, perversely pleased in lashing her apprehensions, and a bachelor. What else could one expect? Of course he may not have kissed her, but if he has, well, what right have I to? Her petulance increased with every moment, and when the bell rang about 10 o'clock, she felt more like a naughty, ill-tempered child than anything else. Remembering that now she had no maid, she controlled herself and opened the door. Her face cleared, for on the threshold stood a man she liked, her manager. "Hello, Ashford," she said. "Come in. I'm glad you've come, for I'm bored to tears." Ashford Billing, a smartly dressed man of 36, entered. One would hardly have guessed him to be connected with the stage, for he had a moustache, was well groomed without over-emphasizing the fact, and had a pleasant look of self-reliance without swagger. He was tall and lean, as if he was accustomed to keep himself in hard condition, and though an American you could scarcely have guessed it from his speech. 4 years in England, during which time he had studied to erase transatlantic idioms and intonations with a view of playing on the stage, had been crowned with almost complete success. Only a stray word, a phrase occasionally, showed that he was not a native born. "It's an early call, Miss Blair," he said pleasantly as he followed her into the sitting-room. "Partly business and partly pleasure. Which will you have first?" "Oh, pleasure," answered Beatrice carelessly. "I'm tired of business. Will you smoke?" "No, thank you." "Well, I'll plunge into the pleasure right away, though there's some business in it too. You know I'm not the man to beat about the bush, so I'll ask you straight out if you're still in the same mind as you were 6 months ago?" Beatrice made an irritated movement of her shoulders. "Oh, bother," she answered. "Fancy calling at this hour to ask me that." "Sorry," said Ashford Billing. He did not appear at all excited, though his eyes gleamed. "My time's hardly my own just now, working day and night over the new production, provincial tours and syndicates. And you never seem to be at home at reasonable hours. I called twice last week. But Mizzy said you were out." Beatrice blushed, and turned to the window to hide the blush. She remembered her instructions to Mizzy. "So I thought I'd come now on the off chance," continued Billing. "Dear Miss Blair, I may not appear romantic or in earnest, but I am. I'm a plain man and want to marry you. You refused me once, but I don't like giving up altogether. Is it any good?" "Not a bit," said Beatrice decisively. "Sorry, Ashford. I like you awfully, but not that way, so you must take that as final." "I will for the present," he answered, looking gloomy for a moment. Then he brightened up. But at the risk of offending, I warn you that I mean to ask you again later on, in case you change your mind. In the American dictionary, there's no such word as impossible. Beatrice was roused at this. Look here, Ashford, she said, biting her lip. Don't you talk to me like that. It's no good, and I won't have it. You'll make me lose my temper in a minute. I've never encouraged you, though I've always been fond of you in a friendly way. Then still there may, you've as much chance, said Beatrice, with flashing eyes, as a bob-tailed dog in fly-time. There's one of your own Americanisms for you, and I hope you like it. Ashford Billing could not help laughing, though Beatrice seemed in a thoroughly bad temper. Say, that's fierce, he said, relapsing. Where did you hear that? Then he became graver. But I won't worry you any more. I'm sorry, but I guess I'll study to improve my manners. Let's get to business, said Beatrice, sitting down. I'm tired to death of this. What is it you want? Well, he said, following her example, I came here for two things. The first was to ask you to be my— Oh yes, good enough. I know that's a back number now, for the present anyway. If that didn't materialize, I wanted to know if you'd care to tour the provinces in a false step. You know we close down in a week, and I'm going to start the tour, number 1 towns only, in the autumn. Beatrice shook her head. No, I'm going to take a rest. You'll have lots of time to take a rest before the tour starts. Why not? Look here, Ashford, you seem to think that I don't know my own mind in anything. I've already refused your offer for a London shop, and I don't mean to think about the provinces. See, I won't be worried any more. She paused, and suddenly burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands. Ashford Billing, long accustomed to the vagaries of leading ladies and hardened in a rough school, was completely taken aback. He had known Beatrice for a fine actress and a finer woman, a woman who had charm, good looks, and character. To see her break down for no apparent reason was not merely distressing, it was a shock. Say, little girl, he said kindly, and there was no hint of disrespect, though on other occasions he was scrupulous in his use of Miss Blair. I'm real sorry. I didn't know you'd feel bad about it. What's the trouble? Can I be of any help? Beatrice recovered herself, feeling extremely ashamed. It's only nerves, she replied, drying her eyes with vicious dabs. I didn't sleep last night. That's all. Give me a cigarette. Billing opened his case and gave her one, looking gravely at her. There was something behind this, he thought, but what it was he could not guess. I won't worry you any more, he said quietly. I'd have liked to book you for that tour, but I guess you know best. You've had a tiring season. Long runs are the very deuce, though they pay the manager. You take that rest you talk of and make it a good one. But let me know when you feel like getting to work again. Thanks, Ashford, said Beatrice, smoking quickly. You're a good sort. But honestly, I'm thinking of giving up the stage altogether. I'm getting sick of it. Billing, who had had the kudos of giving Beatrice her first chance, felt his heart sink. But, realizing that this was not the time to urge mature reflection, he held his peace. Beatrice talked idly a few minutes, trying to appear natural, but the effort was great. Where are you going for a holiday? She asked. Flying, he answered. Across the Channel, perhaps. I've never done it yet. What a queer boy you are, she said, looking at him fixedly. What on earth made you take to the aeroplane? Why on earth did I take to the sky? He laughed. I did it to advertise my first production over here. It was the right goods too, for everyone talked about the actor, manager airman. When I found how exciting it was, I couldn't stop. That's all. You're odd creatures, you men, said Beatrice, musing. I should have thought that managing theatres was exciting enough. Change of excitement. Just like falling in love with a new sweetheart, he smiled. Ah, that sounds like a man. Tell me, Ashford, do all men run after every pretty face they see? You want me to give away trade secrets, eh, Critz? Well, I suppose most men do, until they're hooked. Ashford, hooked? How loathsome! I beg your pardon, I was thinking as a cynical bachelor. What I mean is that I suppose most men swear off the pursuit once they've promised. And never relapse. He shrugged his shoulders. The decent ones don't, but even they sometimes have a bit of a struggle. Take an extreme case, suppose a decent chap gets engaged, and force of circumstances keeps him apart from his divinity for years. He ought to feel bound in honour, not even to think of another, flashed Beatrice. Billing sighed. He ought, but he's up against a tough proposition. At least the decent one tries. Men are horrible, she said wearily. Pretty horrible, he agreed, but there's an amazing lot of unseen goodness hidden in the dirt. Men aren't so bad, some men. But we're getting too serious. I must be off. It's been a bad morning's work for me. He smiled, not very wholeheartedly, but still he smiled. You refuse both my offers, but you'll let me know if I can ever do anything, won't you? That's merely friendly. Beatrice did not smile, but she looked appreciatively at him. Thanks, Ashford, she said. Yes, I've just remembered one thing you can do, read a play by a friend of mine. He groaned in comic despair. All right, he said, but don't make me promise to produce it. Remember, this is my living. No, I only want you to read it. If it's bad, say so like a man. Don't put the poor wretch off with the usual sugary criticism, and don't let it lie for months with all the rest of the lumber. You managers are cruel to authors, and you've had this one lying idle a long time. He did not deny the charge, save by a smile. I'll read it this week, sure, he said. What's it called, and who's the author? I forget the name of the play. The author is a Mr. Mortimer. She said the name quite easily and without a blush, but Billing on the instant thought, who the devil is he, and what does she want to push his play for? But he did not allow his face even to hint at surprise. He just held out his hand and said goodbye, as naturally as if he had not been rejected without any hope of a future recantation. For though he professed optimism, in his heart he felt that Beatrice was not for him, and the knowledge hurt. Goodbye, he said cheerily. Mind you have a good holiday, and come back to work soon. Goodbye, Ashford, she said, trying to keep back some unnecessary tears. She had known him for some time, and guessed what he was thinking. He, she was sure, was at least one of the men who tried. You're a good sort. Goodbye. Then she telephoned to a garage. I want my car at 2 o'clock.